He was a simple gas station attendant, tired and barely making ends meet. One night he noticed a woman in a car who was quietly crying. He approached her with words of support, not even imagining what would happen next. The very next morning, his life changed forever. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The fluorescent lights above the pumps hummed with a monotonous buzz, casting a pale glow over the cracked concrete of the small roadside station. It was late, the kind of late where the highway had emptied, and only the occasional car hissed past in the damp night air. The rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving behind the smell of wet asphalt and gasoline, a scent that seemed to cling to everything here. Inside the kiosk, the radio murmured a low country song, but outside it was the sound of silence and the occasional metallic clang of a loose sign in the wind. James Williams stood by pump number 3, a rag in his hand, wiping away the residue of fuel from the nozzle even though no one was watching, and it made no real difference. At 45, his back ached if he stood too long in one position, and his knees popped whenever he bent to pick up the trash customers left behind. His uniform was clean but faded. The navy blue shirt stretched slightly at the shoulders from years of hard use. He rubbed at his brow, then looked out at the empty road. Nights like this could stretch into eternity. The work wasn't difficult, not compared to construction, where he had once swung hammers and carried lumber under the punishing Texas sun. But construction had broken him, literally. A fall from scaffolding a decade ago left his leg weaker than it should have been. He recovered, but not enough to keep up with the men 20 years younger who climbed like spiders and hauled boards like machines. So here he was, at a gas station on the outskirts of town, working 12-hour shifts for a paycheck that barely covered the bills. Still, there was Mia. His daughter was the reason he got up every morning and dragged himself to work at night. 15 years old, bright-eyed, a dreamer who wanted nothing more than to go to college, study architecture, and build things that would last. James smiled faintly at the thought of her, hunched over her notebooks at the kitchen table, scribbling formulas while he reheated leftovers. She deserved better than this, he thought. Better than a life of counting change at the grocery store. Better than watching her father come home smelling of gasoline and exhaustion. He sighed and shoved the rag into his pocket, glancing at the clock above the kiosk door. 2 more hours to go. He thought about the overdue electric bill on the counter at home and the stack of envelopes that seemed to grow taller every week. He thought about Mia's hopeful face when she asked if she could join the science club's weekend trip next month, and the painful way he'd had to tell her they couldn't afford it. The disappointment in her eyes had cut deeper than any physical wound he'd ever suffered. The parking lot was quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the overhang as the wind shifted. A beat-up sedan rolled in, filled with young men blasting music, laughing too loudly as they tumbled out and bought sodas. They didn't notice James except to toss a crumpled receipt near the trash bin and speed away again. He bent, picked up the paper, and dropped it in the can. When he straightened, his gaze caught on the glow of headlights approaching slowly from the road. A white Lexus glided into the station, smooth and silent, its paint gleaming under the lights despite the rain. It pulled up to pump number 5, rolling to a stop with deliberate slowness. James noticed immediately that it didn't fit here. Most of the cars that came through were dented pickups or old sedans held together by duct tape and hope. This one was pristine, the kind of vehicle he'd only seen in glossy advertisements. The engine cut off, and for a long moment nothing happened. The driver's side window remained rolled up, the figure inside barely moving. James glanced around. No one else was paying attention. The night manager was half asleep in the booth, and the lot was empty. James frowned. Something about the stillness inside that car unsettled him. He took a step closer, his boots scraping against the concrete. Through the windshield he could see her, a woman, maybe mid-40s, her hair carefully styled once, but now loose, falling over her shoulders in uneven strands. Her face was pale under the harsh station lights, and when she turned slightly, he caught the gleam of tears on her cheeks. Her hands clutched the steering wheel as if holding on to it for balance, though the car was already parked. James hesitated. He'd been ignored, dismissed, even sneered at by people like her before. Wealthy customers and expensive cars often treated him like part of the scenery, someone invisible unless they needed a windshield wiped or a receipt printed. He could just stay where he was, finish his shift, and forget the image of her sitting there with her shoulders trembling. But something stirred in his chest, a memory of nights long ago when he had sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the empty chair across from him after his wife's funeral. He remembered the silence pressing in, the helplessness that had threatened to drown him. That same shadow hung over the woman in the Lexus. He turned away, trying to convince himself it wasn't his place, but his feet didn't listen. He found himself walking slowly toward her car, the sound of his boots echoing faintly in the empty lot. The closer he got, the clearer he could hear it, soft, muffled sobs, the kind that carried the weight of someone breaking quietly in the dark. "Ma'am?" he said gently, his voice careful, almost tentative. He cleared his throat, aware of how rough it sounded after hours of silence. "Are you all right?" The woman flinched, her head snapping up as if she had been caught in something private. Her eyes were red-rimmed, mascara running in dark lines down her face. She quickly reached for a tissue from the console, dabbing frantically at her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I don't know where else to go." James paused, his hand resting on the cool metal of the doorframe. He could have walked away then, offered a polite nod and let her be. But the pain in her voice tugged at something deep inside him. Without thinking, he lowered himself onto the curb beside her car, the concrete cold and damp beneath his jeans. "Sometimes we all need a moment," he said softly, his tone carrying the quiet weariness of a man who had lived through his own storms. "Take your time." She turned toward him, eyes wide with surprise, as if she hadn't expected anyone to care. For a long second they just sat there, the hum of the lights above filling the silence. Then with a shuddering breath, she spoke. "My name is Catherine," she said, almost as if reminding herself she still existed. "Catherine Miller." James nodded slowly, offering a faint smile despite the heaviness in his own chest. James Williams." The name hung between them, two strangers in the night bound suddenly by something neither of them could quite name. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the scent of wet earth and gasoline, the sound of cars passing like distant whispers. Around them the world went on, indifferent. But here, on this small patch of concrete, something had shifted. James didn't know yet that this moment, this decision to sit down instead of walking away, would change everything. All he knew was that he recognized her pain, and he couldn't bear to leave her drowning in it alone. The rain clouds had finally drifted eastward, leaving the night sky swollen with darkness but clear of its earlier storm. The gas station lights hummed on, islands of fluorescence in an otherwise empty stretch of road. James sat on the curb, the concrete pressing cold into his legs, the damp air chilling through his work shirt. He felt the heaviness of fatigue in his bones, yet his focus was drawn entirely to the woman in the car beside him. The Lexus seemed to gleam unnaturally bright beneath the lamps, its sleek bodywork polished to a shine that set it apart from the dented sedans and battered pickups that usually trickled through this place. The spotless chrome rims, the perfectly maintained paint, it all screamed of money, privilege, a world far removed from his own. Yet inside that cocoon of wealth was a figure that seemed so startlingly fragile, so human, that the contrast unsettled him. Catherine Miller sat hunched in the driver's seat, one manicured hand still on the steering wheel, though she had long ago cut the engine. Her hair, streaked with elegant silver, had once been perfectly styled, he could tell, but now it tumbled loose in strands that clung to the dampness on her cheeks. Her eyes were swollen, red with grief, and her tissues lay scattered like surrender flags across the passenger seat. The rawness of her pain clashed against the smooth leather interior, the sparkling diamond on her finger, the expensive perfume lingering faintly even here by the pumps. James looked at her and for a moment wanted to retreat, to tell himself this wasn't his business, but his feet remained planted. He had seen too many people walk away when someone else was breaking. He'd been the man left alone before, and the memory of it still stung like a wound that never fully healed. She noticed him watching her, and with an effort tried to compose herself. She pulled a fresh tissue from the crumpled packet in her lap and dabbed at her cheeks, forcing her trembling lips into a semblance of control. But her voice betrayed her when she finally spoke again. "I shouldn't be here," Catherine whispered, more to herself than to him. "I should be home. I don't even know why I stopped." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Sometimes the world stops you, whether you mean for it to or not," he said quietly. "And sometimes you need a place to just let go. It's all right. You don't have to explain anything if you don't want to." Her eyes darted to him then, searching his face as though expecting judgment, but finding only weariness and a quiet patience. For a long moment she said nothing, the silence filled with the distant rush of a semi-truck passing on the highway. Then her lips parted, and the words came in a hesitant tumble. "My husband," she murmured, clutching the tissue tighter. "He's gone. He died last week. A heart attack. One minute we were having dinner, talking about the next charity event. The next—" Her voice broke. She pressed the tissue hard against her mouth, as though trying to hold the sobs inside. James felt the familiar twist in his chest, the recognition of a wound he knew too well. He didn't interrupt, only nodded slightly, letting her feel that someone was truly listening. "I thought I could handle it," she continued, her tone sharpening in bitterness. "I made it through the funeral, through the condolences, through the endless faces saying they understood. They don't. None of them do. Tonight I tried to drive home, but halfway here I realized—" She sucked in a shaky breath. "I realized there was no one waiting for me anymore. The house is so empty. I couldn't keep driving." Her shoulders shook again, and she buried her face in her hands. James wanted to reach out, to place a steadying hand on her arm, but he held back. Some griefs needed space, not intrusion. Instead, he spoke softly, almost as if to himself. "I know that kind of silence, the kind that waits for you in every corner of the house. It's heavier than any noise in the world." Her head lifted sharply, her tear-streaked face turned toward him in disbelief. "You know?" she asked, her voice breaking. James met her gaze steadily, though the memories it stirred were like shards of glass in his chest. "My wife," he said, the words coming slowly, heavily. "Cancer took her 6 years ago. One day we were arguing about bills, and the next the doctor was telling me I had to prepare myself to lose her. After the funeral, I sat in our kitchen and stared at the chair where she used to sit, and I thought that silence was going to eat me alive." Catherine's lips trembled, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the parking lot around them ceased to exist. The buzzing lights, the damp air, the passing trucks, all of it faded until there were only two people on a curb, bound by grief. She let out a long, uneven breath. "You do know." James nodded. He didn't need to say more. Some truths didn't require explanations. For several minutes they sat together without speaking. The night stretched around them, vast and indifferent, but within that small circle of shared sorrow, something fragile began to form, a connection neither had expected. Catherine wiped her cheeks again, her hands still trembling, but her sobs had quieted into softer breaths. "I'm sorry," she whispered at last. "You didn't need to hear all of that." James gave a small shake of his head. "Sometimes the only thing people need is someone who doesn't walk away." The words hung between them, simple and true. Catherine blinked rapidly, as though trying to absorb them. She studied him then, really studied him. The uniform shirt, the calloused hands resting on his knees, the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. He looked like a man carrying burdens of his own, yet he had stopped to ease hers. "James," she repeated softly, as though testing the name. "I won't forget that." And for the first time that night, though her eyes still glistened with tears, there was something else in her expression, an acknowledgement, a glimmer of gratitude that pierced through the fog of grief. The station remained quiet, the night deepened, and yet James felt the faintest sense that something larger than himself had begun to stir. He could not name it, could not guess at where this moment would lead, but he knew one thing with certainty. In choosing to stay instead of walk away, he had stepped into something that mattered. The wind shifted across the empty lot, stirring a plastic bag that skittered along the pavement before snagging against the base of the air pump. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, stark shadows beneath the cars, and James felt the weight of the silence pressing in around them. Catherine sat with her head bowed, shoulders trembling in the driver's seat of her Lexus, the streaks of mascara on her cheeks catching the glow of the lamps. For a long moment neither of them spoke, though James could hear her breathing quick and shallow, as though each inhale was a battle. He cleared his throat, aware that his voice when it came might sound too rough, too intrusive, but leaving her in this state felt like an abandonment he couldn't accept. "Ma'am," he said softly, careful to keep his tone gentle, almost deferential. "Are you sure you're all right?" The words seemed to startle her. Her head snapped up, eyes wide, as though she had forgotten he was sitting there beside her car. She scrambled for a tissue and dabbed frantically at her eyes, attempting to erase the evidence of her tears. But no amount of frantic gestures could disguise the anguish carved into her face. I'm fine," she stammered, her voice brittle as glass. "Really, you don't need to worry." James tilted his head, watching her carefully. He had heard those words before, spoken by men at the construction site who hid their pain until it destroyed them, spoken by neighbors who smiled through clenched teeth while the weight of life slowly broke them. Fine was a word that covered everything but the truth. He leaned back slightly on the curb, resting his forearms on his knees. "Sometimes saying you're fine is just another way of saying you're not," he said quietly. She blinked at him, her lips parting as though she meant to argue. Instead, her face crumpled and the pretense fell away. She pressed the tissue to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with sobs that came harder now. Rawer. When she found her voice again, it was no longer controlled, but halting, broken. "My husband," she whispered. "He died last week. One moment we were together, and the next," her words faltered, her hand tightening on the steering wheel as though she could anchor herself to it. "A heart attack, just like that. And everyone says they understand. They come to the funeral, they say the right words, but they don't know. They don't know what it's like to have the world collapse around you." James felt his chest tighten with an echo of her pain. He knew that collapse, the way it stole the air from your lungs, the way it made every corner of your home feel like a reminder of absence. She turned to him suddenly, her tear-filled eyes searching his. "I don't know where else to go. I drove because I thought maybe the road would take me somewhere I didn't feel so hollow. But it didn't. I stopped here, and now I can't even bring myself to drive the rest of the way home." Home. The word cracked in her throat, bitter and heavy. "It doesn't feel like home anymore." For a moment, James said nothing. He let her words hang in the cool air, let them settle between them like fragile glass that might shatter if handled too quickly. He wanted to offer comfort, but he knew sometimes the comfort was simply in being heard. At last, he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, and he meant it. She looked at him sharply, as though daring him to prove it. The tears on her cheeks glistened under the harsh lights. "You can't," she whispered. "You can't possibly." James's jaw tightened and his eyes drifted down to his scarred hands, the calluses that told their own story. He drew in a steadying breath. 6 years ago, he said, his voice low and steady, "my wife, Angela, passed away. Cancer. By the time we found out, it was already too late. One day we were laughing about something on the radio, and a month later I was standing by her bed, watching the life leave her. People said the same things to me then. They said they understood. They meant well, but they didn't. Not really." Catherine's lips parted in silence, her eyes widening slightly. He continued, his voice softer now, as though speaking not just to her, but to the memories that still lived inside him. "After the funeral, I went home. I sat in our kitchen. There was her chair, empty. The silence." He paused, swallowing hard. "The silence was like a weight pressing me into the ground. I thought it would never end. Some nights I wanted it to end me instead." Her hand fell slowly from the steering wheel, her tissue forgotten in her lap. The raw disbelief on her face shifted into something else, recognition, understanding. "You do know," she breathed, her voice trembling. James nodded again, not trusting himself to speak more. They sat together in the night, the world moving on around them, cars passing on the distant highway, the neon signs flickering, the steady hum of the lights overhead. But in that small space of cracked concrete and buzzing lamps, two strangers shared a silence that no longer felt so crushing. Catherine drew in a shuddering breath, her voice quieter now, calmer. I thought I was invisible, that no one could possibly understand what it feels like to have the person who made life make sense just vanish. James met her gaze, his own eyes tired but steady. You're not invisible, he said simply. Not tonight. For the first time, she let out something close to a laugh, though it was shaky, fragile, caught halfway between a sob and a sigh. She wiped her face again, her shoulders easing slightly as the weight of her grief shifted, if only a fraction. My name is Catherine, she said, her voice steadier this time, as if reclaiming herself. Catherine Miller. James offered a small, weary smile. James Williams, he replied. And with that, the distance between them seemed to close. Two names exchanged in the quiet night, two lives intersecting in a moment neither had expected. James didn't know what would come of this, whether it was just a fleeting encounter or something that would ripple outward into the rest of his life. But he knew one thing with certainty. He was glad he had spoken the first words, because sometimes in the deepest silence, it only takes one voice to remind someone they're not alone. The night deepened as though the sky itself had sunk lower, heavy with stars that the buzzing station lights could not quite erase. Catherine sat in her car, the streaks of tears drying stiff along her cheeks, and James remained on the curb, elbows braced on his knees, staring at the ground as if the cracks in the pavement might provide an answer neither of them could put into words. They were strangers, yet the silence between them felt oddly familiar, not empty, but full of something unsaid. James shifted slightly, the cold concrete seeping through the fabric of his jeans, and exhaled long and slow. His body ached with the fatigue of another 12-hour shift, but his exhaustion had fallen into the background. What filled his chest now was that sharp recognition he had seen in Catherine's eyes, the shock of finding someone else carrying a wound like your own. He had lived with his pain so long it had become part of his skin, invisible to others. But here was this woman, elegant and broken in equal measure, and she had looked at him as if she finally wasn't alone in hers. She broke the silence first. I don't know why I'm telling you all this, Catherine whispered, her voice low, raw. You don't know me. James looked at her, his eyes steady. Maybe not. But I know what it feels like to sit in a car at night, thinking you don't have anyone left to talk to. That's enough. She studied him for a moment, and then her gaze softened, as though she could see past the uniform and the gasoline smell clinging to him, down to something truer. Do you still think about her? She asked hesitantly. James didn't have to ask who she meant. He leaned back, rubbed a hand over his face, and nodded. Every day. Some days it feels like she's still in the next room, and I'll catch myself calling her name. Other days it feels like I made her up, like there's no way someone that good could have been real. But then my daughter smiles the way her mother used to, and I remember. The mention of his daughter seemed to light something in him. His voice, tired and gravelly, grew softer, warmer. Mia. She was 9 when her mama passed. Just a little thing. I didn't know how I was supposed to raise her on my own. I was angry, lost. Some nights I'd come home from work and just sit in the dark, wondering what the point of it all was. I even thought, maybe she'd be better off without me. Maybe she'd have a chance if someone else took her in. Catherine's breath caught. She turned toward him fully, as if compelled by the honesty of what he was admitting. And what stopped you? James's lips pressed together. He stared at his hands, calloused and scarred, knuckles swollen from years of labor. He remembered the weight of those nights, the way despair had clawed at him like a physical thing. Slowly his gaze lifted, and there was a glimmer of memory in his eyes. One night I was sitting at the kitchen table, head in my hands. I didn't even realize Mia was awake. She padded in, barefoot in her pajamas, holding her little bicycle helmet in her hands. She asked me, Daddy, who's going to teach me to ride if you're gone? His voice cracked on the words and he swallowed hard. That was it. That was the moment. I realized it wasn't just about me. She needed me. And no matter how heavy the silence got, I couldn't leave her to face it alone. Catherine's eyes shone, tears slipping down her face again. But this time they weren't just tears of grief. They were something else too. Recognition, hope, the realization that pain shared was somehow less unbearable. James gave a small, humorless laugh, glancing down at the ragged concrete beneath his boots. I'm not saying it got easier overnight. It didn't. I had to learn how to pack lunches, sign homework sheets, braid hair badly. For the first time, a smile tugged faintly at his lips. I had to figure out how to be both mom and dad. And I'll be honest, I still mess it up most days. But she's 15 now, smart as anything. She wants to be an architect, says she'll build skyscrapers that'll scrape the stars. His voice swelled with pride even through the weariness. And she just might. Catherine inhaled slowly, her hand pressed against her chest as though holding something fragile inside. You kept going for her. James nodded, his gaze distant. For her, and because I realize grief doesn't mean life ends. It means you carry them forward with you, in ways you don't expect. The words settled over them like a blanket. Catherine turned her face toward the windshield, blinking rapidly as if fighting to keep control. She thought of the hollow mansion waiting for her, of the empty side of the bed, of the silence that echoed like a scream in every room. And for the first time since her husband's death, she wondered if maybe she too could keep moving, not away from the pain, but with it. Her voice trembled when she asked, "Do you ever stop missing her?" James's answer came without hesitation. No, and you wouldn't want to. Missing her means she mattered. The ache's the proof of the love. Catherine turned toward him again, her eyes searching his face. In the pale light, she could see the deep lines of fatigue, the scars of hard work, the weariness of someone who had carried burdens too heavy for too long. Yet beneath it all, there was a strength she hadn't expected, a quiet dignity, a kind of survival she couldn't help but admire. You look tired, she murmured, concern threading through her grief. James chuckled softly, the sound low and rough. 2 jobs will do that to you. 2? He nodded. Construction during the day, stocking shelves at night. Doesn't leave much time for sleep, but it keeps food on the table. And Mia deserves more than scraps. His jaw tightened as he spoke, betraying the pride and the weariness bound together in his voice. Catherine felt something crack open inside her chest. Here was this man, living on exhaustion, working himself raw, struggling with bills and responsibilities that would overwhelm most. And yet he had chosen, in this moment, to sit with her, a stranger, and offer comfort. The contrast was staggering. She, with all her wealth and privilege, had folded under the weight of loss, while he, with so little, carried his pain and still had enough compassion left to share. She wiped her face again, though her hand trembled. You stopped for me, even when you're barely holding it together yourself. James gave a small shrug. Sometimes that's when it matters most. When you've been where someone else is, you can't just walk past. The words lingered in the air, resonating deeply. Catherine realized she hadn't felt this kind of genuine human connection since her husband's passing. No polished condolences, no scripted words. Just truth, raw and unpolished. And as she looked at James, sitting in his worn jeans and faded uniform shirt, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet still alert with kindness, she felt the faintest spark of something she hadn't thought possible. The sense that maybe she wasn't entirely lost after all. The night wore on, the gas station settling into a deeper quiet as fewer cars rolled through. But inside Catherine's chest, a shift had begun. She had come here thinking she had no place left in the world. Now sitting beside a man who bore his scars openly, she felt for the first time in days that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The hours slipped by unnoticed, time melting into the quiet hum of the gas station lights and the distant whisper of passing trucks. The night had stretched long and heavy when James and Catherine found themselves still sitting there. sharing a silence that no longer felt oppressive, but oddly protective, like two weary travelers resting in the same shelter. The raw edges of grief and exhaustion had softened in the presence of someone who truly listened, and though they were strangers, something unspoken bound them together. Catherine leaned back in her seat at last, her body still trembling from the waves of emotion, but the sobs had slowed, her breathing steadier now. The tissue crumpled in her hands was damp, yet she clutched it as if it anchored her. Her eyes, though red-rimmed, no longer darted wildly. They lingered on James as if his presence alone gave shape to her scattered thoughts. "You're different," she said suddenly, her voice quiet, almost uncertain. "Everyone else says the right things, rehearsed phrases about how time heals, how he's in a better place, how I'll get through this. But you," she stopped, swallowing hard. "You don't talk like that." James's tired eyes lifted to hers, the corners lined from years of hard work and sleepless nights. He shrugged lightly. "Because it isn't like that. Time doesn't heal. It just teaches you how to carry it, and you never stop carrying it. Not really." Her gaze wavered, but then she nodded as if she had needed someone, anyone, to give her permission to feel what she already knew. "Yes," she whispered. "That's it. Everyone tries to fix it with words, but it can't be fixed, can it?" James shook his head slowly. "It can't, but you can keep going. Not because it stops hurting, but because the hurt means they mattered. And that's worth carrying." For a moment she simply stared at him, tears pooling again, though softer now. Not wild or uncontrollable, but almost cleansing. She turned away, looking out through the windshield at the empty lot, her voice trembling as she spoke again. "Do you know what I keep thinking about?" The sound of his laugh. It filled the whole house, you know. Now the house feels like a tomb. Every room echoes. I walk in and it's like he's been erased. Except that he hasn't, because his absence is everywhere. Do you know what I mean? James's throat tightened. He did know. He could remember the way Angela used to hum when she cooked, the way her voice had filled their little apartment, and how unbearable the silence had been after she was gone. He didn't answer right away, but the look on his face was enough. Catherine saw it, and her expression softened further, as though she understood he carried the same ghosts. "Tell me about her," Catherine said suddenly. "Your wife, if you don't mind." James blinked, caught off guard. He rarely spoke of Angela to anyone outside of Mia, but something about Catherine's brokenness, her raw honesty, made him feel safe enough to share. He leaned back against the post of the pump, his eyes distant. "She was the strongest person I ever knew," he began. His voice was rough at first, but it steadied as the memories poured through him. "She laughed like nothing could touch her. When I first met her, I thought she was out of my league. She was smart, ambitious, beautiful. But she saw something in me I didn't see in myself. She gave me the kind of life I never thought I'd have. Family, a home. And when she got sick, she fought, harder than anyone I've ever seen fight. But in the end," he shook his head. "In the end, all I could do was hold her hand and tell her she wasn't alone." Catherine's eyes glistened, her lips trembling. "That's all I could do too," she whispered. "Nathan, my husband, he was larger than life, strong, confident, always looking after me. And then, in one night, I was the one holding his hand, watching him slip away. I never thought I'd be the strong one. But I wasn't. I'm not. You are," James said firmly, surprising her. "You're still here. That's strength. Even when you don't feel it." The conviction in his voice startled Catherine, and she lowered her eyes, but his words sank deep, planting themselves in the soil of her grief like seeds waiting for the chance to grow. They fell silent again, but it was no longer the silence of two broken people drowning separately. It was the silence of two souls who had recognized each other in the dark. Around them, the world went on, headlights streaking across the highway, the flicker of a neon sign, but none of it mattered in that small circle of connection. After a long while, Catherine turned back toward him. Her face was softer now, less a mask of anguish and more a portrait of someone beginning, just barely, to breathe again. "What's her name?" she asked gently. Your daughter. James's lips curved into the faintest smile. Mia. She's 15, smart as a whip, wants to be an architect, always building things out of cardboard and glue. I come home and the kitchen table is covered in bridges and towers. She swears she'll build a skyscraper that touches the sky one day. Catherine's brows lifted slightly, and for the first time all evening, she managed a small, real smile. She sounds remarkable. She is, James said, pride warming his voice. She's the reason I keep going. Catherine studied him, her expression thoughtful. You're exhausted. I can see it in your face, and yet you stopped for me. You sat down on this curb, even when you probably should be home sleeping. James let out a quiet laugh that held no humor. Sleep doesn't come easy anyway, but sometimes stopping for someone else is the only thing that makes sense. The words lingered in the cool night air, and Catherine felt her chest loosen, just slightly. She had thought she was alone in her grief, invisible in her pain. Yet here was this man different from her in every imaginable way, and he had looked at her, truly looked, and chosen to stay. As she sat there, studying the lines of weariness in his face, the calluses on his hands, the quiet strength in his voice, she realized something startling. This stranger, this gas station attendant, with nothing to offer her but his presence and his honesty, had given her more comfort than all the polished words of her wealthy friends. And in that moment, Catherine felt the faint, flickering truth she had been unable to see since the night her husband died. She wasn't completely alone. The following days slipped by in a blur of routine for James. He worked his shifts, counted the crumpled bills in his wallet, came home to Mia, helped her with homework, and reheated whatever leftovers were left in the fridge. Life pressed forward as it always had, exhausting, relentless, familiar. But something in him felt altered, unsettled since that night at the station. He didn't tell Mia about Catherine, not yet. How could he explain to his daughter that in the middle of a rain-damp parking lot, he had found himself sitting with a stranger who mirrored his own grief so closely that it had shaken him? Instead, he carried the memory quietly, replaying their conversation in his mind as he stocked shelves at the grocery store or hauled lumber on the construction site. The way she had looked at him when he said missing someone meant they mattered. The way her shoulders had eased, just slightly, as though she had borrowed a piece of his strength. By the third morning, exhaustion had settled so deep in his bones he felt hollow. He trudged out of his building, his worn work boots crunching against the gravel, a thermos of black coffee in hand. The sky was barely light, dawn still tangled in streaks of gray. He had a 20-minute walk to the bus stop, then another hour to the site. Same as always. But when he turned onto the street, he stopped short. A black Cadillac idled at the curb in front of his apartment building, sleek, polished, and utterly out of place among the dented sedans and rusted trucks lined up along the block. Its tinted windows reflected the pale light of morning, and the engine hummed with the low, expensive sound of something finely tuned. James frowned, unease prickling the back of his neck. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out. He was in his 60s, tall, with silver hair perfectly combed back, his navy suit cut so sharply it might have been sewn onto him. A leather briefcase hung at his side, polished so bright it could have doubled as a mirror. The man's eyes, however, carried warmth, not the cold indifference James expected. "Mr. James Williams?" the man asked, his voice rich, professional, but not unfriendly. James froze, shifting his thermos from one hand to the other. "That's me," he said cautiously. The man extended a manicured hand. "Robert Patterson, attorney at law. May I have a word?" James stared at the offered hand before slowly shaking it, the firm grip startling against his own rough, scarred palms. "Attorney? Look, if this is about bills, Patterson shook his head, cutting him off gently. "Nothing of the sort. I represent Mrs. Catherine Miller. I believe you met her a few nights ago." James blinked, his grip loosening on the thermos. "Catherine?" He could see her again instantly, tear-streaked, fragile, clutching tissues in her car. Is she all right?" The lawyer's expression softened. She's doing much better. In fact, she insisted I come see you personally. She told me about your conversation, about how much it meant to her. James shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the cracked sidewalk, the peeling paint of his building, the curious eyes of Mrs. Patterson from next door peeking through her curtains. He wasn't used to attention, let alone from men in expensive suits driving cars that cost more than his yearly income. I don't understand, he admitted. You will, Patterson said, his tone patient. He gestured toward the apartment building. Might we step inside? I'd rather not discuss important matters on the sidewalk. James hesitated, his instincts warring with the surreal nature of the moment. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, all right. Inside, their apartment was small but tidy. The living room bore mismatched furniture, an old plaid couch, a second-hand coffee table scarred with years of use. But it was clean, with Mia's school books stacked neatly on the side. The lawyer took it all in with a discerning eye, but without judgment. Mia emerged from the kitchen in her school uniform, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She froze when she saw the stranger in the living room. Her eyes widened, darting to her father for explanation. It's okay, sweetheart, James said quickly. This is Mr. Patterson. He's a lawyer. He, works with Mrs. Miller, the woman I met the other night. Mia looked from her father to Patterson, suspicion and curiosity mingling on her young face. Why is he here? That, Patterson said kindly, setting his briefcase on the table, is what I came to explain. He unlatched the brass locks, the click echoing in the small room, and drew out a folder bound with a dark blue ribbon. He set it gently in front of James, who eyed it like it might explode. What's this? James asked. Mrs. Miller was deeply moved by your compassion, Patterson said carefully, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. She asked me to come here and offer you something on her behalf. A gift, yes, but also an investment. She believes strongly in supporting people of character. And after speaking with you, she is convinced that you and your daughter represent precisely the kind of family her late husband would have wanted to honor. James's hands shook slightly as he tugged at the ribbon and opened the folder. Inside were pages of crisp legal documents, their margins filled with numbers that made his head spin. He caught phrases full scholarship, educational expenses covered, tuition, housing, enrichment programs. He swallowed hard. This can't be real. Mia leaned over his shoulder, her eyes growing wide as she skimmed the words. Dad, she whispered, her voice quivering. Does this mean college? Patterson's smile warmed. Not just college, young lady. If your grades hold, this covers everything. High school programs, college tuition, even graduate studies should you choose. Mrs. Miller wants to ensure that you have every opportunity to pursue your dreams. Mia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears pooled in her eyes and she turned to her father. Dad, this is everything. James couldn't speak. His throat locked, his vision blurring as the words swam before him. He had spent years bracing himself for disappointment, for scraping by, for telling his daughter no. And now, in the hands of a stranger, lay a future brighter than he had ever dared imagine. But Patterson wasn't finished. He withdrew another sheaf of papers, heavier, more formal, embossed with seals. Mrs. Miller also asked me to present you with these. Consider it part of the same gift. James reached for them, his heart pounding. When he realized what he was reading, he nearly dropped the pages. House? His voice cracked. She bought us a house? Patterson nodded. In Riverside. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a backyard, and this part was her special request, a workshop. She thought your daughter might need a space to explore her architectural ambitions. James sat frozen, his breath shallow. He glanced at Mia, who stood beside him, trembling, tears streaming down her face. Why? James whispered, the word barely audible. Why would she do this? She doesn't even know us. Patterson's gaze softened, almost reverent. Because you saved her, Mr. Williams. That night at the gas station, she wasn't just grieving. She was contemplating whether she had a reason to keep going. You gave her one. You reminded her that compassion still exists, that humanity is worth believing in, and she wants to honor that by changing your life as you change hers. James buried his face in his hands, the papers trembling in his lap. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, just stopped, just listened. Yet somehow that simple act had rippled into this. Beside him, Mia slipped her arms around his shoulders, her voice breaking with joy. "Dad, we don't have to struggle anymore." James pulled her close, holding her as though the world might vanish if he let go. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, strong and alive, and for the first time in years he let himself believe in miracles. And all the while Robert Patterson stood quietly, watching the father and daughter cling to each other, his expression touched with something like awe. When he finally spoke again, his voice was gentle. "The house will be ready for you by the weekend," he said. "Mrs. Miller hopes you'll accept it, not as charity, but as healing. For her, and for you." James lifted his head, eyes shining with tears, his voice ragged. Can we thank her? Properly?" "You will," Patterson promised. "She wants very much to meet your daughter. But more than that, she wants to see her dream. Her husband's dream live on through the bridges Mia will one day build." The Cadillac waited outside, its engine still idling softly, as if the world beyond had paused in respect for what had just unfolded. James stared at the papers spread across his battered coffee table, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the future did not terrify him. It beckoned. The apartment felt impossibly small after Robert Patterson left. James sat hunched over the coffee table, the folder of documents spread out before him like treasures from a world that couldn't possibly belong to him. The papers gleamed white under the weak light of the single lamp, their embossed seals and neat typeface so out of place among the scuffed wood and hand-me-down furniture. Mia sat cross-legged on the couch, her backpack forgotten at her feet, staring at the words she had already read 3 times as if they might vanish if she looked away. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. James ran his calloused fingers along the edges of the documents, half expecting the ink to smear or the paper to crumble into dust. Every instinct in him screamed that this couldn't be real. Life didn't hand out miracles to men like him. Life handed him overtime shifts, overdue bills, and broken promises, and yet here it was, the impossible sitting in his living room with blue ribbons and legal stamps. Finally, Mia broke the silence. Her voice trembled, a whisper of disbelief. "Dad, do you think it's a trick? Like maybe it's too good to be true?" James forced himself to look up at her. His daughter's wide brown eyes glistened, reflecting both hope and fear. She had learned too young not to trust good things. He swallowed hard. "I don't know," he admitted. But Mr. Patterson didn't look like the kind of man who wastes his time on tricks. "And Catherine." He trailed off, the memory of her tear-streaked face at the gas station flooding back. "No, I think she meant this." Almost as if in answer, James noticed the second envelope tucked inside the folder, separate from the contracts and legal forms. Unlike the crisp white paper of the other documents, this envelope was cream-colored, thick, with Catherine's name signed delicately across the back. His hand trembled as he picked it up. "Dad," Mia said softly, leaning forward. "It's from her, isn't it?" James nodded slowly. "Looks like it." He slid it open carefully, pulling out a folded letter written on stationery so fine it felt strange in his rough fingers. He cleared his throat, unfolded it, and began to read aloud. "Dear James, I don't know how to thank you. The truth is, the night you found me at the station, I wasn't just crying. I wasn't just grieving. I was deciding whether I could bear to keep going. My husband Nathan was everything. He was my compass, my anchor, the reason my days had meaning. When he died, I lost not just him but myself. I left the cemetery that evening, certain there was nothing left worth holding on to. I pulled into that station to say goodbye to the world in my own way." James paused, his voice tightening. Mia's hand crept into his, small and warm. Grounding him, he continued. "And then you appeared. You didn't know me. You had no reason to care. Yet you sat down on the curb beside me, weary and exhausted as you must have been. And you chose compassion. You gave me words I hadn't heard from anyone else, truth instead of platitudes, empathy instead of pity. You reminded me that grief doesn't mean life ends. It means the love mattered. That one simple act. It saved me. Truly, it saved me. James had to stop again, wiping a hand across his face. The words blurred as tears stung his eyes. Mia squeezed his fingers, whispering, "Keep going, Dad. You told me about your daughter, Mia, how she dreams of building towers that scrape the sky, how you work yourself raw to give her a chance. I thought of Nathan then. My husband dreamed of leaving legacies that stood tall, structures that would endure long after he was gone. In your daughter's dreams, I hear his voice again. In your sacrifice, I see the kind of love he believed kept the world turning. And I know he would want me to help her, to help you. This scholarship is not charity. It is a promise to carry forward the legacy of a man who lived for compassion and vision, and to honor the kindness of the stranger who reminded me why I should keep living. The house, too, is not charity. It is a place where your daughter can dream, where you can rest, where grief can become hope again. Please accept these things not as gifts, but as healing for you, for me, for the people we loved and lost. With deepest gratitude, Catherine Miller James let the letter fall into his lap, his chest heaving as though he had run a mile. He pressed his hand over his mouth, fighting the sob rising in his throat. Mia sat beside him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She said you saved her life." James shook his head slowly, overwhelmed. I just sat down, that's all I did." Mia looked at him fiercely through her tears. "No, you didn't walk away. Everyone else did. But you didn't." The words pierced him, and for the first time in years, James let himself cry in front of his daughter. They clung to each other on that battered couch, the letter lying between them like a bridge connecting their lives to Catherine's. When he finally pulled back, his voice was rough but steady. "This changes everything, Mia. Not just the scholarship or the house. Everything. Because it means kindness matters. Even when you've got nothing left to give, it matters." Mia nodded, her small face shining with determination through her tears. "Then we'll make sure her gift isn't wasted. I'll work harder than ever. I'll build those towers. I'll make them proud." James pulled her into another embrace, his heart swelling with both pride and awe. He had thought their lives were destined to be a struggle forever. But Catherine's letter had cracked the walls of despair wide open, and in its place, possibility rushed in like light breaking through the clouds. The papers still sat on the table, waiting for signatures, but the letter was what made it real. Not the legal jargon or the numbers too large to comprehend, but the truth written in Catherine's own hand. One act of kindness could ripple outward and change the course of lives. As night fell outside their window, James folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into its envelope. His hand still shook, but his heart felt steadier than it had in years. For the first time, he believed the future might hold something more than survival. It might hold hope, and hope, he realized, was the greatest gift Catherine Miller had given them. The letter remained on the coffee table all evening, its folded edges soft from where James had run his thumb over it again and again, as if trying to convince himself it was real. The apartment, normally filled with the quiet background noise of dishes clinking or the hum of the refrigerator, seemed to thrum with something different that night, a kind of electric stillness, as if both James and Mia were waiting for the world to catch up with what had just happened. Dinner had been an afterthought, some leftover macaroni heated on the stove, but neither of them touched it much. Their minds were elsewhere. Mia sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her school books unopened beside her. She hadn't stopped glancing at the envelope on the table, her eyes flicking to it like a magnet every few seconds. Finally, unable to keep quiet any longer, she leaned forward, her voice soft but urgent. "Dad," she whispered, "do you really think this is for us? That she meant it?" James exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. His body was heavy with the exhaustion of years, but his heart was restless, alive with emotions he could hardly name. "I think she did," he said carefully. "Catherine, she didn't strike me as someone who does things halfway. If she wrote it down, if she put her name to it, then she meant it." Mia's eyes widened and tears shimmered at their edges. Then I can really go to college? I don't have to just dream about it anymore? James felt a lump rise in his throat. For so long, he had carried the guilt of knowing his daughter's dreams were bigger than the life he could provide. He nodded, his voice rough. Yes, sweetheart, you can. The words broke something open inside her. She gasped, pressing her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking as tears spilled freely. But they weren't the quiet, hopeless tears of disappointment he had seen too many times. These were tears of joy, of possibility. James stood and crossed the small space between them, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, her small frame trembling with the enormity of the moment. Dad, she sobbed against his chest, I promise I'll make this worth it. I'll work harder than anyone. I'll study every night. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll build towers, bridges, whole cities if I have to. I'll make you proud. I'll make her proud. James's arms tightened around her, his own eyes wet. You already make me proud, Mia. Every single day. This... He pulled back slightly to look into her face, brushing the damp strands of hair from her forehead. This isn't just about building towers. This is about building a life. One where you don't have to struggle the way I did. One where you can wake up and know you're doing what you love. Mia sniffled, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand. But what about you? You've worked so hard, Dad. Maybe this isn't fair. Maybe you should get something too. James chuckled softly, though his heart ached at her words. I already have it. Do you know what it feels like to see your child's dreams within reach? To know you're not sending her into the world with nothing but hope and scraps? That's everything I ever wanted. You don't need to worry about me. But I do, Mia insisted fiercely, her young voice trembling with passion. You gave up so much for me. 2 jobs, no sleep, no life of your own. You think I don't notice, but I do. I've seen you come home barely able to stand, your hands so raw you can't hold a fork right. I've seen you staring at the bills, trying not to let me see. And still you make sure I'm fed, make sure I have notebooks and pencils. You deserve this just as much as I do. James swallowed hard, stunned by the force of her words. His little girl, who had once clung to him with scraped knees and childish fears, was now looking at him with a wisdom far beyond her years. He cupped her cheek gently, his rough thumb brushing away a tear. I didn't give anything up, he said quietly. I chose you. Always. Every shift, every sleepless night, every dollar stretched, it was never a sacrifice. It was what any father would do if he loved his child as much as I love you. Mia's chin wobbled, and then she buried her face in his chest again, holding on as if she never wanted to let go. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other, while the documents and the letter sat on the table like silent witnesses to their new future. Later, after she had calmed and retreated to her small bedroom to change for bed, James remained in the living room, staring at the folded letter. He thought of Catherine, sitting in her car at the gas station, broken and lost. He thought of the strange, fragile connection that had sprung between them in that hour. And he thought of the way her words had turned his world upside down. The door creaked softly and Mia padded back into the room in her pajamas. She stood there hesitating before finally speaking, her voice small. Dad? Yes, sweetheart? And when we move to the new house. She twisted the hem of her shirt nervously. Will we still remember Mom? The question hit James like a blow. For a moment he couldn't answer, his throat tight. He looked at her, at the earnest fear in her eyes, and his heart ached. He set the letter aside and opened his arms. She climbed onto the couch beside him, curling into his side like she used to when she was small. We'll always remember her, he said gently. Moving doesn't mean forgetting. Your mom will always be a part of us, no matter where we live. Every laugh, every memory, it all comes with us. A house is just walls and a roof. What makes it home is the love we carry inside. Mia nodded slowly, comforted by the certainty in his voice. And will we remember this place too? Even when we have a big house with a workshop? James glanced around their cramped living room. The faded rug, the scuffed coffee table, the marks on the wall from where Mia had once tried to do cartwheels indoors. He smiled softly, bittersweet. Yes, we'll remember. The good and the hard, because this is where we grew together. It's part of our story, and you never forget your story." She leaned against him, her breathing evening out, the weight of her small body warm against his side. James pressed a kiss to her hair, his chest tightening with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. For so long, their life had been about surviving one day to the next. Now, for the first time, he felt the horizon stretching wider, filled with possibilities he had never dared hope for. He stayed there until Mia drifted to sleep, her head resting on his shoulder. Carefully, he carried her back to her room, tucking her beneath the thin blanket. He lingered at her bedside, watching her face in the soft glow of the nightlight. "Your future's waiting for you, baby girl," he whispered, "and I'm going to make sure nothing takes it away." When he returned to the living room, the letter was still waiting on the table. James picked it up one more time, running his fingers across Catherine's name. He didn't know why she had chosen him, why a stranger's kindness had rippled into something so immense. But he knew one thing. He would not waste it, for Mia's sake, and for the woman who had seen in him something worth saving. And for the first time in years, James allowed himself to dream not of bills paid or shifts completed, but of a life built with hope. The Riverside house still felt like a dream when James and Mia moved in. Their belongings, just a handful of boxes, mismatched furniture, and a few photographs, looked small inside the spacious rooms, swallowed by the sheer size of the place. The cream-colored walls gleamed, the hardwood floors shone as though freshly polished, and the backyard stretched wide with its massive oak tree casting dappled shadows across the grass. But it was the workshop that left Mia speechless, her hands trembling as she touched the smooth surface of the workbench, her eyes bright with possibilities. Days passed in a blur of unpacking and adjustment. Neighbors stopped by with smiles and casseroles, curious about the new arrivals. James worked less now, Patterson having assured him that finances no longer had to consume every waking moment. For the first time in years, he was home in the evenings, cooking meals instead of heating cans of soup, sitting with Mia while she did her homework rather than dropping in exhausted at midnight. Still, there was something unfinished, something lingering. The letter had said so much, had changed their lives in ways James couldn't begin to repay, but he needed to see Catherine again. He needed to thank her properly. Mia, too, asked about her often, her curiosity bubbling every time she stood in the workshop. "When will she come, Dad? When can I show her what I've been building?" The answer came one Friday evening. The knock on the front door was gentle, almost hesitant. James wiped his hands on a dish towel and crossed the hallway, heart suddenly thudding. When he opened the door, there she was. Catherine Miller stood on the porch, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her frame elegant in a simple blue dress that flowed softly around her. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers, not the kind sold in high-end florists, but fresh, bright blooms gathered with care. For a moment, James couldn't speak. Gone was the shattered woman from the gas station. Her face, though still marked with grief, was lighter, steadier, as though she had found something to hold on to again. "Mrs. Miller," James managed, his voice rough. She smiled faintly. "Catherine, please, may I come in?" Mia darted into the hallway, her eyes wide, her voice filled with excitement. "You're here! You're really here!" Catherine's smile widened, and she bent down, offering the flowers. "These are for you. I thought your new home could use something bright." Mia took them reverently, her cheeks flushed. "They're beautiful. Thank you." She turned, rushing to the kitchen to find a vase. James stepped aside, gesturing her in. "Please, welcome." The evening unfolded with a warmth James hadn't dared hope for. They sat around the kitchen table, still the old scarred one from their apartment, but now standing proudly in a room that gleamed with space and light. James served roast chicken and potatoes, simple fare compared to the meals Catherine was likely accustomed to, yet she praised it as though it were a feast. Mia dominated the conversation at first, her enthusiasm unstoppable. She brought out the models she had already built in the workshop, a suspension bridge strung together with string and popsicle sticks, a cardboard tower reinforced with toothpicks, sketches of buildings drawn in the margins of her school notebooks. She spoke with her hands, eyes shining, every word tumbling over the next. Catherine listened with rapt attention, nodding, asking questions. "Why did you choose that design? What problem were you trying to solve here? Her voice was gentle but curious, encouraging Mia to explain. When the girl finished, Catherine's eyes softened, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Nathan would have loved this. He was fascinated by young minds that could see possibilities where others saw only limitations. James watched the exchange, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and gratitude. He had never seen Mia so alive, so confident. And Catherine, she looked years younger, her face lit not by makeup or wealth, but by the glow of genuine connection. Over dessert, just a simple chocolate cake Mia had begged to bake, the conversation turned more personal. Catherine spoke of her husband, of his first job as a junior draftsman, of the way he used to spend hours sketching buildings that might never exist. Her voice cracked once, but she steadied herself, continuing with a quiet reverence that filled the room with his presence. Mia listened intently, absorbing every detail, as though Nathan's spirit might somehow guide her own path. At one point, Catherine paused, looking across the table at James. "Do you know what struck me that night?" she asked softly. "It wasn't just your kindness. It was that you carried so much of your own burden, and yet you still had room for someone else's. That's rare. Nathan believed that compassion like that was what held the world together. Seeing it in you reminded me he wasn't wrong." James felt heat rise to his face. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his hands. "I didn't do anything special. I just couldn't walk away." Catherine smiled gently. "Sometimes that's the most special thing anyone can do." Later, after Mia excused herself to finish some homework, James walked Catherine to the porch. The air outside was cool, fireflies flickering near the oak tree in the yard. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet he had once thought was reserved for other people's lives, not his. Catherine lingered on the step, her eyes glistening in the porch light. "I need you to know something," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "That night at the gas station, I had given up completely. I don't say that lightly. I was ready to end my life. And then you appeared. This weary, kind man who had no reason to care, who looked at me and saw my pain instead of turning away. You reminded me that Nathan's belief in humanity wasn't naive. You reminded me there are people worth living for." James's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of her words held him silent. She reached into her purse, pulling out a photograph. A young man, dark-haired, wearing a hard hat, stood proudly in front of a half-built skyscraper. This was Nathan on his first job site. I'd like Mia to have it. He believed that every great structure begins with a dream and the courage to pursue it. I think she'll understand that better than anyone. James took the photograph with reverent care. "Thank you," he said quietly. Catherine's eyes softened. "No, thank you for giving me a reason to wake up each morning. Watching Mia grow, seeing her excitement, it's like having a piece of Nathan back in my life. This isn't charity, James. It's healing. For all of us." They stood in silence for a moment, the night around them gentle and still. For the first time in years, James felt not just the weight of survival, but the stirrings of something lighter, something brighter, hope shared between strangers who had become something more. The last days of summer burned into autumn, but for James, the season felt entirely new, as if the world itself had shifted under his feet. The riverside house was no longer strange. The echoes that once haunted its wide rooms were slowly replaced by the sounds of life. Mia's laughter spilling from the workshop, the soft creak of floorboards as she raced down the hallway with another model in her hands, the warmth of dinners shared at the kitchen table without the shadow of exhaustion hovering in the corner. It was a life James had never imagined possible, one not built on scraping by, but on something sturdier. Hope. He had fewer shifts now, and though his body still bore the weight of years of labor, his evenings were different. He came home not to collapse on a couch, but to lean over Mia's shoulder as she sketched, to help her balance her models with toothpicks and glue, to hear her chatter about suspension systems and design principles he barely understood. For once, he was not missing her childhood. He was in it, present, alive. And Catherine came often. Sometimes she arrived with books, Nathan's old engineering texts, their margins filled with his handwriting. Sometimes she came with nothing but herself, sitting at the table with tea, listening to Mia's endless explanations, smiling through her tears. There was still grief in her eyes, but it no longer consumed her. Instead, it had softened, reshaped into something that gave her purpose. Watching Mia, she said once, felt like watching her husband's spirit continue its work in the world. One crisp evening, after Catherine had left and Mia had gone to bed, James stepped outside. The porch light cast a warm halo across the steps, and the oak tree's leaves whispered in the wind. He lowered himself onto the top step, the wood cool beneath him, and stared out at the quiet street. It struck him how far he had come from the gas station that night. He could still see it in his mind. The cold concrete beneath him, the hum of the pumps, the sight of a woman breaking down in her car. He had almost walked past, almost told himself it wasn't his place, that she wasn't his problem. But he hadn't. He had stopped. He had spoken. And that choice, simple, human, unremarkable to anyone else, had changed everything. He thought of the scholarship documents signed and filed, the deed to the house resting safely in his drawer, the photograph of Nathan now framed on Mia's desk in the workshop. He thought of Catherine's words on the porch, the admission that she had been ready to end her life until he reminded her she wasn't invisible. The weight of it pressed against his chest, not a burden, but a staggering truth. The world didn't change because of grand gestures or great wealth. It changed because one person saw another's pain and chose not to turn away. James drew in a long breath, releasing it into the cool night. His hands, still rough, still scarred, rested on his knees. For years, those hands had only known toil. Now they had built something else entirely. Connection, healing, a bridge between griefs. Behind him, the door creaked open softly. "Dad?" Mia's voice, small and sleepy, floated into the night. He turned, smiling gently. "Shouldn't you be asleep, kiddo?" She padded out barefoot, her pajama pants too long and dragging on the wood. She came to sit beside him, curling into his side the way she had since she was small. "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, then whispered, "About Mrs. Miller, about how we didn't know her, but now she feels like family." "And about that night? What if you hadn't stopped, Dad? What if you had just walked away?" James swallowed hard, pulling her close. Then maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe she would have been alone in that moment, and maybe we'd still be in the apartment, counting pennies. "But you know what, sweetheart?" "What?" He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I didn't stop because I thought something would come of it. I stopped because she was hurting. That was all. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't come with promises. You just do it because someone needs you to." Mia nodded thoughtfully, her young face lit by the porch light. "So, kindness really can change everything." James felt his throat tighten, but he nodded. "Yes, it can." They sat in silence for a while, the night wrapping around them. Fireflies blinked near the oak tree, and in the distance a dog barked once before settling again. Finally, Mia whispered, "Do you think Nathan knows that his mom helped us? That I'm going to build the bridges he dreamed about?" James looked up at the stars, their cold light steady and eternal. "I think he does," he said softly, "and I think he's proud of her, of you. Maybe he even had a hand in making sure our paths crossed that night." Mia smiled sleepily, leaning against him. "Then I'll build something for him one day, a bridge that will never fall down, just like he wanted." James closed his eyes, holding her close. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer frightening. It was a horizon lit not by fear of what they lacked, but by faith in what they could create. When Mia finally drifted off, James carried her inside and tucked her into bed. He paused in the doorway, watching her breathe softly, and whispered, "You're my miracle, kiddo." Later, as he lay in his own bed, James thought again of the question that had started it all, the one he had asked a stranger in the middle of the night. "Are you all right?" 2 simple words. A question asked 1,000 times every day, often without meaning. But when spoken with sincerity, when backed with compassion, it had saved Catherine Miller's life. It had given him and Mia a future. It had built a bridge between despair and hope. James smiled faintly in the darkness, the weight of exhaustion softened by the warmth in his chest. He knew now what he would tell anyone who asked how their lives had changed so completely. He would tell them the truth. It began with a moment of kindness, and sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. If this story moved you, don't just let it end here. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the next story that could change the way you see the world. And if you're ready for more, click on one of the next videos on your screen. Each one is a journey you won't forget. Most importantly, share this video with a friend or family member. You never know whose life a simple story might touch today.